Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. I am Kyle Anslone, and I'm joined by the co-host Will Porter. Will, how's it going?
What's up, Kyle? How you doing, man?
I'm doing good. For people who don't know, Will's a staff writer over at RT. I'm the assistant editor at antiwar.com, the news editor at the Libertarian Institute, and of course, we co host this great YouTube show that also gets put out as a podcast 3 days a week, every Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And make sure people are subscribing to the YouTube channel. We're putting out a lot of great content there. We also put out clips of all the show. So, if you think we really nailed it on like the Iraq part of the show or something like that, and you want to let your friends see that, definitely check out the YouTube channel to share that. Right on the page, I put up like the newest playlist of all the clips every right after every show, and then we have the Twitter page, and the show is of course hosted at the Libertarian Institute, which is where you find the show notes page with all the great stuff, like the links to the articles we talk about, and then the links to all the different conflicts of interest stuff, so you can make sure you're following us on all the different social medias. I think with that, we could get into it. The only other thing I noticed, Will, is that we're now over 10 ratings and reviews on iTunes, which is great. It's a brand new
Nice.
show, so helping having a few of those rating and reviews does give it a little bit more legitimacy for anybody who's just kind of coming by and clicking on it. So we really appreciate that. People said a lot of great, really nice things, and we're just gonna keep trying to put out good content so we could get some more of those. And with that, Will, we have a pretty interesting story to start today. It gained quite a bit of like national-ish attention just because the headline looks so absurd, which is two Boogaloo Boys charged for conspiring with Hamas in alleged part to overthrow the government. So, I've seen things on Twitter like Booga trending. I personally like the term Hamaloo better, but I don't think that's gonna fly. But anyways, tell us how we got here, Will, and explain to us how this was probably an entrapment, right?
Yeah, I mean, you kind of get that impression if after you go through the story. But yeah, let's start with the start. First things first. I guess I should first thing. I don't know if everyone knows what the Boogaloo Boys are, so maybe I could just like quickly summarize that. Like, I don't even know if you'd call it a movement. Like, it's a community or movement or some grouping of people, but largely like right-leaning libertarian type of people who they basically believe there's like going to be another civil war. And whether they are preparing to contend with the civil war or they're actively trying to bring it about, that kind of depends on who you ask. It's kind of like a broad, vague grouping. It's not like any kind of explicit organization. It's kind of in a way like you might call it like a right-wing analog of like Antifa almost. Not exactly, but just in the sense that it's like decentralized and it doesn't have one single organization. Um, but anyway, last week, the DOJ came out and said it was charging these two guys, Benjamin Teeter and Michael Solomon, with conspiracy to provide support for a terrorist organization. And they're accused of trying to link up with Hamas, the Palestinian militant group that governs Gaza, and has a political wing to it as well, but it is also a militant faction. And apparently, these two guys were trying to act as mercenaries. That was the word that the DOJ used, that in some capacity working as mercenaries for Hamas and trying to sell them untraceable guns and suppressors and other kind of gear like that. Um, and ultimately, the DOJ claims that this is all to raise money for their own group, which, as you referred to it, the Mujahideen. It's a great name for their group. But they wanted to raise money for the Mujahideen so that they could buy a training facility, apparently, so they could practice for overthrowing the government and the upcoming civil war they believe is going to happen. And so that is the government story here anyway, is that they tried to link up with Hamas in this plot to overthrow the government and build a training facility and all this stuff.
So,
Um,
Will, do you have any idea on like did the DOJ explain why Hamas or what the ideology of the Boogaloo Boys are here? Just because it seems to me, and I guess you would have a similar feeling to this, is of groups in the Middle East. Hamas seems like they're probably the ones struggling the most financially and would have the most difficult time having these kind of ties and relationships, just based on the fact that Gaza itself is like the most strictly confined area. Even the Houthis, I would guess, in Yemen have a little bit more like room to operate, whereas Hamas is just under complete Israeli surveillance all the time. And so, is there any indication as to why it was this particular, you know, because like you would assume that like if they're just looking to link up with an Islamic group, there's like the Taliban, Al Qaeda, AQAP, there's jihadists all over North Africa now. I'm just curious.
I mean, they keep it fairly simple. The DOJ, they just basically said these guys, like, they shared the motivation of like opposing the U.S. government, like a sort of like the enemy of our enemy kind of thing is what, that how the DOJ was phrasing it. I'm not 100% sure how they ended up like, expressing interest to do something with Hamas, because I know for a fact they never talked to anyone actually in Hamas. This whole thing, they were always the whole time they were talking to a undercover FBI agent. I think at first they like got referred to the FBI through some witness or through some like confidential informant, but ultimately the guy they thought they were talking to in Hamas was the FBI agent undercover.
They may be interested in a group that would seem to have a little bit better funding and ease of access, having a relationship with somebody in the U.S. rather than Hamas. And so it does kind of make sense to me if it was just like they found this guy in a chat room and kind of lured him to the point where he made this agreement or deal. But is there anything else on like are there any more details about this that we should know other than I think a pretty critical one here, which is that nobody from the U.S. actually talked to anybody from the Middle East.
Yeah, yeah. As far as we can tell, they only were in contact with like surrogates from the FBI. They never actually got in touch with Hamas. But yeah, there are a few other details that I would just to clarify some things, because like right after this DOJ announcement came out last week, you had all these people on Twitter calling these guys white supremacists, just like running with the idea that they were neo-Nazis of some sort. But they clearly did not actually read the DOJ release, because if you read that, you'll see this one weird part where they say that these guys were planning on destroying U.S. monuments, and they were plotting to raid the headquarters of a white supremacist organization in North Carolina. And so that's kind of if they're Nazis, it's kind of a weird thing for them to be targeting other white supremacists. And I mean, that's not all too. Like they appeared in all kinds of media reports, because these two guys were showing up at the protests in Minneapolis a lot in their military gear and their rifles and stuff. And so they ended up appearing in some of these media reports on the Boogaloo guys. And the one guy, Teeter, told CNN that he identified as an anarchist and that he was there to protect protesters from the cops and from white supremacists. So again, like kind of cuts against the idea that this guy is himself a neo-Nazi, if that's why he's saying he's there. And similarly, the Solomon guy also told a local media outlet that he was at the protest to protect protesters from the police, and that he stands with George Floyd and all this stuff. So again, not very likely. I think we can pretty much lay to rest the idea that these guys were Nazis of some sort.
Right, yeah. That's really interesting, and I wonder what it was about Hamas that, well, I mean, I guess it could be that the FBI guy didn't represent Hamas's ideology at all when he communicated with these guys. He could have said anything, I suppose. It could be very well that these guys have no idea who Hamas actually is or what Hamas actually does, and so it's one of those crazy things where we now have this kind of claim that, oh, thankfully for the FBI we prevented terrorism, when in reality, there was never really a terrorist involved in this plot at all, it seemed.
Right, and like the whole DOJ allegation too is not so much that they were like working directly with Hamas and Hamas was going to help to overthrow the government. It was just that Hamas like allegedly factored into their plot to raise money to to do that. And so like it's they're kind of tangentially tying Hamas into this. But I would stress too that like this is all just the DOJ story. This is where we're getting this from. And so the DOJ and the FBI are not exactly like the paragons of honesty and truth and stuff. So I would these are allegations instead of facts. I would remind people.
Right, that's important, and I'm sure in a year and a half, we will be breaking down a very long Trevor Arison article that's at The Intercept explaining how these guys really never meant for anything bad to happen. They were just, trying to protect people in a chat room. And this guy came along and said, oh, I could help provide, you guys with a couple, guns and some training. And they said, oh, boy, that sure sounds interesting. And the fact that this guy was, involved in Hamas didn't have actually all that much to do with anything. other than it just being an FBI agent that sounded, impersonating, I guess, or claiming to be somebody from Hamas, but, sounding like, oh, I can help you out and stuff like that. So, the truth in these cases, actually, the evidence ends up thinner than you expect most of the time. And so
Yeah.
that's what I'm expecting us to come across. But certainly, if they actually are somehow white nationalist jihadists, I guess we'll be following up on that too, because that sounds like a very interesting story as well. Is there anything
Yeah.
else on this, Will, before we get into Trump's very interesting comment?
No, I think that's it for the Mujahideen for now, at least.
All right, so me and Will have about 20-second clip here of Donald Trump making one of his most interesting comments of his presidency. And
Yeah.
so we'll go ahead and listen to that and then respond.
Military. I'm not saying the military is in love with me. The soldiers are. The top people in the Pentagon probably aren't, because they want to do nothing but fight wars so that all of those wonderful companies that make the bombs and make the planes and make everything else stay happy. But we're getting out of the endless wars. You know how we're doing.
All right, Will. So there you have it from the president. The soldiers on the ground loves him, and the Pentagon hates him because they just want to make money and help the arms dealers. Now, I mean, there's so much here, right? There's like kind of the hypocrisy from Trump's end because he spent 3.5 years now bragging about his massive military budgets and selling weapons to the Saudis and the Emiratis and everybody else on the planet. But at the same time, this is, I think, a fairly accurate comment, and the establishment completely lost their mind over it. So maybe first, Will, let's just start with the, kind of concept of what Trump here said here is very important and very accurate.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is something that seems like only he would ever say, that you could only get away with. Like, I can't really see any other president saying this kind of thing. It's like, it was kind of like Eisenhower's whole military industrial complex thing, just like translated through Trump's like Twitter brain, I guess, and like very direct and blatant. But he is hitting on an extremely important point, of course, like what they call the revolving door between the arms industry and the Pentagon. And that's absolutely true. He's completely right about that. There are hundreds. The project on government oversight actually did a study on this. I don't have the data, the numbers right at my fingertips, but it was hundreds over like the last 15 years. Hundreds of top generals and admirals and vice admirals, all kinds of top brass at the Pentagon, who end up going through this revolving door, and they end up becoming lobbyists or consultants or executives at Lockheed or Boeing or General Dynamics, the arms industry. And this is effectively what Eisenhower was warning about, the joining of the military and the weapons sector, that where they kind of fuse and become a single interest group. And so that is sort of what Trump is hitting on here, saying that the generals just want to make money for the arms industry. And yeah, I think he's absolutely correct about that. And it's a vital point to make, that only Trump, was amazed to even see him making this point.
Right. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. That was an important point to be made, and it's good to hear our president say it. So now maybe we could get to the next point, which is, if you look at Donald Trump's presidency over the first 3.5 years, almost nothing he does has reflected this. Kind of what he talks about in his speech, other than maybe you could talk about him trying to get out of Afghanistan, talking about drawing down in Iraq, and at times talking about getting out of Syria. And I think he even mentioned getting out of Syria pretty recently too. But
yeah, in that same presser, actually.
Right.
He mentioned it right there, yeah.
Yeah, but it hasn't happened yet, which is the big
No.
the big problem. And he is the president. And so how do you, I don't know, maybe how do you, Will Porter, or how do you think Donald Trump squares the problem that his administration obviously doesn't do what it needs to be doing if he believes this is true?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't know how he expects us to hear this kind of criticism and go yeah, right on, Trump, and not also recognize that, as you said, he's presided over these gigantic, budgets that, are keeping our spending, we're outspending the next 11 largest militaries on the planet combined still. And that's his doing. He's approving those budgets. And so I don't know how he expects us to hear him say this and not hold him accountable and responsible for the very thing he's talking about. And as you mentioned, you know, bragging about the arms deals and stuff, you know, as if Lockheed just hates him for, you know, these arms deals. It's you know, a little bit incongruous, a little contradictory, I guess. And I'm not sure how he expects, you know, how he expects people listening to square that circle, but I guess maybe just he hopes they'll ignore it, I guess.
Right. You know, one, I guess, thing he mentioned specifically was bombs. And he kind of says that, you know, the generals just want to sell bombs. And so sometimes I kind of think that he's like so incompetent or really doesn't understand things that maybe he thinks that the, you know, military industrial complex is just interested in selling bombs. And, you know, the bulk of the budget isn't coming through the aircraft carriers and the F-35 and, you know, some new ICBMs that I think you reported on pretty recently. And, you know, these massive, you know, missile defense kind of projects that are absolutely huge. I mean, Trump created an entire new branch in the military, and that branch is a Space Force, which I'm guessing is going to be like an even bigger dream for the military industrial complex, because, you know, space is high technology. So I'm sure everything they're doing is getting outsourced and there's contracts for all of it. Right. And yet, you know, he comes here and says this. And then, you know, one of the most interesting parts about it is the reaction from everybody who has a check mark on Twitter, who's, first of all, you know, claiming this is an unprecedented attack, you know, against the military from the president, when, you know, as you point out, maybe it's a little bit more tangential and blunt, but this is essentially what Eisenhower said, you know, 60s, 80 years ago now, Will? I'm not sure. Yeah. I think like 64 she gave that speech, but yeah, it's been a long time. And so how, I guess, how is it that, you know, these people like Ted Lieu, who has to know that Congress passed like the largest military budgets in history under Trump, now like just proceed to like attack him? Like he blatantly attacks the Pentagon. Like, I would feel like from, you know, Ted Lieu or any congressman or anybody, it would be best to call him a hypocrite and point out how he's, you know, supporting the very, you know, kind of particular institutions he claims to be, you know, against most.
Right. I mean, like, the whole context of this quote too, we should mention, is like that Atlantic piece from Jeffrey Goldberg we covered in the last show,
right,
where they're accusing Trump of being, you know, of trash talking fallen troops and stuff. And so this is Trump trying to kind of push back against that whole perception and saying, like, the troops love me, but the military industrial complex, the brass hate me. And it just seems like the pundits you're talking about, people like Bill Kristol and these, you know, liberal hawk type of reporters, CNN people, MSNBC people, they're just like blowing past this distinction Trump's trying to make. They're just trying to make it, again, an attack on the military and just lump it back into that same kind of like attack on Trump, that, oh, he's anti-military, he hates our troops. But you would think, I mean, Bill Kristol, maybe not, you know, he's a ridiculous hawk, but some of these more liberal, like CNN people, you'd think that they would accept the whole, like, I thought that was something that most people did kind of accept, that like the military industrial complex does exist. There are these like perverse incentives, but I guess when it's Trump saying it, you know, like they just see opportunities to attack him, I guess.
Right. Well, I think this was a big Elizabeth Warren issue, and I think she wrote or was a part of like a big push as far as passing the regulation that's supposed to at least like put like a little doorstop in the you know, revolving door, where like you have to wait 2 or 3 years after you get out of the military to go take a job on the board of one of these companies. Now, I'm sure they have ways around it, or like there's absolutely no barrier to you then go becoming a pundit and working at MSNBC or something like that. But you know, there are definitely a real concern among the left about this revolving door. And yet, when you have the president actually talk about it, all anybody could do is bother to bash him, because everybody, you know, it's all, you know, boils down to, well, as Nancy Pelosi said, all the roads lead to Putin. So, you know, that's, you know, even this tweet from Ted Lieu, the congressman that you put in your article here at RT, that's what he says, you know, this is Putin. Crazy.
Yeah, I will cut in real quick. There was one congressperson, Ro Khanna, who did like do exactly as you're suggesting, and busted out the whole hypocrite argument that like kind of imply that Trump's right about what he's saying here, but he's a hypocrite for, expanding Obama's budgets. And, Ro Khanna is sometimes okay on some of these issues. I think he's been okay on Yemen and a few other things. So I guess he would be the one to point that out.
Yeah, that's a good point. North Korea is another issue that Ro Khanna is usually on the right side of.
Yeah.
I guess, do you have anything else on this before we go ahead and move over here to talking about some crazy things the U.S. is doing on the Russian border?
No, I think we hit all the things. Trump said something true, but he's a damn hypocrite. So.
Yeah. All right. Well, that could be the theme of the show, really. I'm sure we'll be talking about that a lot. Well, as long as he's president. Let's see here, Will. So we have this incident on the Black Sea that isn't infrequent these days, where Russia scrambled a bunch of fighter jets to intercept 3 U.S. nuclear-capable B52 bombers testing the Crimean border over Ukraine and the Black Sea. And then we have some more details here, basically saying that this has been going on for a while. Jason Ditz at antiwar.com has been doing a great job of trying to keep up with this and pointing out there's been a lot of cases where they're the U-2 spy planes that the U.S. is flying over there. Also, I've learned that the U-2 spy planes have now linked different systems with U.S. missiles, and so while it's a spy plane and that may sound, more like a observation thing than a military thing, they could actually control missiles with those and have like extended range. And so like if you have an F-35 or an F-16 fire some Tomahawks, these U-2 spy planes would be able to help control them or help to relay the controls from the missile to the plane to like the pilot or whoever's controlling them to more accurately hit the target. And so even if it's not the big nuclear capable bomber, just about anything we're doing there presents a threat to Russia, and there's a lot of military involvement. But Will, give us some more details on this issue, because it certainly does seem like a big deal to have 3 U.S. nuclear bombers and 8 Russian fighter jets all flying around in the same area.
Yeah, no kidding. First, what you said about the U-2s, I actually wasn't aware of that. That's fascinating. We recently talked about how the Chinese were doing a live fire naval exercise. They flew one of those U-2 things over there. So that makes that even more kind of dangerous and provocative. But yeah, as you're saying, with Russia, there have been several similar incidents like this over the last couple of weeks. But last Friday, you had this, what you're talking about with the B-52s. There's some dispute as to whether all 3 were over like the Black Sea at the time when all this happened, but I think it was 3 American B-52s flying with Ukrainian flanker aircraft. But they were flying right along the border of Crimea there over the Black Sea. And of course, Russia now considers Crimea its own territory. It annexed it after all the troubles in Ukraine in 2014. And yeah, Russia responded to that, these American bombers and these Ukrainian jets, by scrambling 8 of its own fighters. I think it was 4 Su-27s and 4 Su-30s. So a pretty forceful response there. And fortunately, that didn't really end up, nothing came of that. The planes kind of saw each other and went their own ways. They didn't have any further conflict. But there is a lot of speculation now that this was a American intelligence trap, actually, and that the whole purpose of this was to get the Russians to scan these aircraft with their radar, and that these other American surveillance craft that were nearby, hovering around at the time, that they scooped up that data, that the signals from the Russian radars. And so people are saying this was an obvious American intelligence trap. However, the Russians, though, too, also gained from this, because I think this is the second time ever, I think, a B-52 flew over Ukrainian airspace. And so it's not every day that the Russians get to scan incoming real American B-52s doing practice runs and get that kind of intelligence. So I guess there was sort of an intelligence benefit on both sides throughout all this.
Right. And
but yeah, I mean, that's
to the jet. I was wondering, I'm sure you don't actually know this, but just at what cost to the taxpayer? Flying 3 B-52s is a massive, massive bill. That's not cheap. That's, more money than me, Will, and probably everybody else who lives in my apartment building will make it in this coming year. So, the life-changing amount of money for a lot of people, and that, carry this out in this massive operation. The other thing that just scares me is if we're doing this once, how many other times are we doing this to try to provoke this response and get China or Russia to scan our planes so we could get more information on their radars?
Right. Yeah, just like the cost of the fuel alone, like you're saying, like that's our salaries for how many years, just for that, and that's a daily thing for them in terms of just blowing money. But similarly, we have other costly operations. Just exactly a week prior to that incident with the B-52s, I think August 28th, you had it was during this huge NATO drill called Allied Sky, where the U.S. sent 6 B-52s to fly over all 30 NATO countries. So we're talking, for thinking about the cost of fuel for that, how much would that run us? But during that whole thing, it was this huge show of force mission. It was like an unprecedented NATO aerial exercise. But a Russian fighter ended up actually pursuing one of those B-52s, apparently into Danish airspace. So the Allied, powers claim. There's actually a video of this where the Russian fighter does appear to have done this like very provocative headbutt maneuver, where it like cuts right out in front of the American aircraft. And we got like 100 feet away from it. And, of course, the Americans denounced that as hostile and unprofessional and all this stuff. So that it does appear to have happened. The Russians, though, deny that they ever crossed into Danish airspace. And Denmark, of course, is a NATO member. So that, that is significant. But we had this other, close encounter with American B-52s just like a week prior to this other one near the Black Sea. So there's been all kinds of aerial encounters between the U.S. and the Russians lately. And while all this was, I'm sorry, were you going to say something?
Yeah, no, I was just going to add, I mean, and we saw in Syria in recent weeks where on the ground we had U.S. and Russian armored personnel vehicles running into each other. And so, fortunately, we're not playing bumper planes yet. We're just playing bumper cars. But once that does happen, this is a long time ago for us, Will. And so this is something I don't remember, because I wasn't watching the news every day, but being a big deal during the George W. Bush years when I think it was a U-2 spy plane that collided with some kind of Chinese thing, or it was a U.S. spy drone that collided with the Chinese spy plane. It was something like that. And they end up going down, and like people were really worried the U.S. was going to escalate and go to war with China over this. Now, fortunately, Colin Powell, taught the whole thing down and did some good work there. But it wouldn't be unheard of if this thing spiraled into something bigger, more sanctions, more expelling of ambassadors, or, more kind of retaliation maneuvers like this, that, planes will only collide with each other so many times before leaders start making worse and worse decisions. And especially, that if Donald Trump is president and this happens, then the whole Democratic, establishment plus the Never Trump establishment is going to come out and they're going to go absolutely insane if he doesn't do something in retaliation. They'll claim, oh, Putin gave him the orders, Putin's letting him do it. So I think Trump is going to feel a lot of pressure to do something about that. Will, do you got anything else on particularly these, aerial incidents with the B-52s? I know we got some more NATO drilling to talk about, though.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that, while all this was happening, all these aerial incidents, the U.S. was setting up in Estonia, right on the Russian border, to do this huge live-fire artillery drill. So it's not just in the air. You also have a lot of, ground deployments. And I think that kind of brings us into the next thing we wanted to talk about here is the U.S. training deployment in Lithuania. So maybe you can get that started for us.
Yeah, so I got this article here from our friend Dave DeCamp over at antiwar.com. Hundreds of U.S. troops arrive in Lithuania for drills near Belarus's border. For people who don't know, Belarus is probably the closest former Soviet state with the Russian government. And they even have some, deals that give Belarus or Russia some autonomy over Belarus existing from the Cold War days. I don't think Belarus is necessarily as dependent on Russia as, let's say, Puerto Rico or Guam would be on the U.S., but it's somewhere on that spectrum. And so the U.S. placing these troops right on Belarus's border, I'm sure to Russia is a big signal, because if NATO were to invade Belarus, that would probably be a red line for Putin and would result in some action. So, I don't think, that the buildup we have here in Lithuania is anything like an invasion force. However, it is, as we were saying before, a huge waste of money, how much we're spending to transport all these troops from where they should be in the United States to way the hell to Belarus with all their armored personnel vehicles and whatever else. I think Dave DeCamp says about a dozen Abram tanks. So, they're spending all this money to transport all of this equipment out there. And, they're just going to LARP around for a few days and then go back home or go back to their base in Poland or wherever they're stationed. And it's not going to really, I guess, do anything at best. And at worst, it's, just the preview of a war between the U.S. and Russia that will likely, end up with nuclear warfare. So I don't know, Will, what exactly would the benefit to this drill be? Do you have any idea, what would be other than, getting to claim like a show of force or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I tend to think is that, like, whatever, in addition to whatever military benefit they get from doing the exercises themselves and sort of integrating with like other, allied forces or something. Yeah, I do think this is sort of geopolitically meant to send a message to the Russians, of course, because we are fairly close to not directly on their border like we were during the Estonia drills, but still fairly close there to Russia in terms of being, very far east. But I think another major effect of this, too, is to very much spook the president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, who is right now under a lot of pressure to resign because the opposition claims that the last election was rigged, which it very well may have been. He won by like an 80% landslide, and he's been in office since like 1994 or something. So, he may be kind of his days may be numbered there. But this guy, Lukashenko, has been accusing NATO of building up forces on Belarus's border. And NATO has denied this like repeatedly, but this deployment here, which I think is like 500 American soldiers and like 40 vehicles, including some tanks, as you said. Like that deployment, I don't think is going to help convince Lukashenko that there isn't a NATO buildup right on his border, because that's kind of what's happening there. And the Lithuanians did come out with a statement, and they're saying that this deployment was not meant as a threat to any of its neighbors, and that's not related to any recent troubles in the region. Referring to Belarus's election issues. But one thing that did happen, though, is they apparently at the last minute extended this exercise from being 2 weeks long to 2 months long. And that was because they announced it before the Belarusian election. And so obviously the whole deployment can't be because of that. But they did, after the election, announce that they were going to extend it from 2 weeks to 2 months. And so that also, I think, is not going to help to allay suspicions from Lukashenko that this has something to do with Belarus and his country. And of course, Lithuania is involved in the Belarusian sort of situation. Like one of the main opposition figures from Belarus, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, has fled there, and they've sort of given her refuge. And so whether they like it or not, they are a neighbor to Belarus and like do have some kind of involvement in their politics. And so, the Belarusians are probably not going to be convinced that they're not looking to intervene. But fortunately, though, I have not seen a big indication that the U.S. is looking to get really involved in Belarus. So I very much doubt that this deployment has anything to do with that, regardless of what Lukashenko is going to say or think.
Right. Well, I guess, if you are Lukashenko, you do have to feel a little bit like if things were starting to get really crazy, could this possibly be a force that would, attempt to move in and maybe secure a small area during the unrest, maybe secure almost a small area like they did in Syria around the Al Tanaf base, and essentially make it a staging area for the opposition or something like that, and give protection to it. I don't see these things being completely beyond worry for Lukashenko, who as you point out is obviously some kind of more of a tyrant than a justly ruled leader or something like that, although like you said, he wins with 80% of the vote. Maybe he does have a majority of support, but that doesn't mean he also couldn't rig the election to make it look like 80/50. I kind of suspect that Al-Sisi could be elected president of Egypt, except he arrests all of his opposition, so he wins with 98% of the vote. And it's one of those things where it's like, yeah, he probably could win and be democratically elected, but not with those kind of numbers. So while we have the Black Sea, we have the border of Belarus. Now let's move to Russia's southern border with Georgia, where NATO is hosting major drills there. have a post here from Defense Post that says some 2,800 troops from U.S., France, Britain, and Poland will take part in what they call the Noble Partner 2020 exercises to be held near the capital of Georgia. And I have this nice tweet from the U.S. Army that says, "Look out below," and it's a picture of a bunch of U.S. Army paratroopers jumping there in the border with Russia. So, it's one of those things where, like, they generate a little propaganda. The Army Twitter account puts out this cute tweet, but at the same time, that's not what's actually going on here. And it's a very provocative interaction with, a country that Russia has said if it becomes a NATO partner, that's a red line. Georgia and Ukraine are the two big red lines for, Russia on NATO expansion. And yet you have 2,800 NATO forces, doing major military drills in Georgia. I'm sure the Russians are feeling pretty uncomfortable with this, especially as we point out what else is going on around and on Russia's borders too.
Yeah, I mean, like, I would just invite listeners to imagine, like, what the reaction in the United States would be if Russia were conducting live fire artillery drills and these aerial exercises and troop and vehicle exercises in, Canada and Mexico or Puerto Rico or something, in like our very close, our next door neighbors. And like, I don't know if people can actually imagine that because like we don't see that happening. Like you do have Russian forces in like Venezuela or something, but that's like still a continent away. That's South America. Whereas, NATO and the U.S. regularly conducts these very provocative exercises literally right on Russia's doorstep. And so, and we're like, they're just supposed to accept that and think that's fine. But yeah, I don't imagine the U.S. response would be the same, if Russia were to do the same thing.
Right. Well, I know occasionally I will see a story about like a Russian surveillance ship of some kind being off of America's East Coast or West Coast or something like that.
Alaska, yeah.
Yeah, and I will see a lot of people will post that on Facebook who don't pay attention to foreign policy and kind of say, "Oh, look, the Russians are encroaching on American territory." And again, this is a surveillance ship, not a nuclear capable plane. It would be very interesting to see what happened. Like, remember, Crimea, the Black Sea, this area is only a few hundred miles from Moscow. It's not very far from that border, as well as other, major Russian cities are not very far from their eastern border. Almost all the Russian population, I think, actually lives on the European, like, continental shelf and everything. And so, like, all their, population, major cities, economic areas are all, right in this area that would be directly threatened by any kind of, hostility from NATO. And so there's an absolute reason why Russia, it gets very concerned when the U.S. is meddling around on their borders. And so if there's a, Russian, nuclear capable plane flying over the Atlantic and gets within 1,000 miles of DC, people will lose their minds, like really lose their minds. And that, the US could just do that and Russia's supposed to take it. And if, they, intercept with their planes, then that's an example of Russian aggression.
That's right. And Trump must do something about it. We must like sanction them or something.
Right. So, Will, let's talk about Julian Assange. We have mentioned on the last show that his extradition hearing was getting kicked off this week, and I guess so far it's about what we would expect. It's not going particularly well, especially like with the procedural hearings and stuff like that for Assange. We had this issue, I guess, where the U.S. 3 weeks ago added a superseding indictment to what Julian Assange was already charged with. And his defense team started out by kind of trying to say that this is really changing the nature of what the U.S. is claiming. They had like prepared a particular defense to essentially claim that, the extradition was political because everything really rested on, Julian Assange publishing the leaks from Chelsea Manning. But now with the new claims, there's basically, I believe what the U.S. is claiming is that there's a couple FBI informants that got dirt on Assange back in Iceland, and then there was this kid who impersonated Assange, who they're also kind of claiming what was somehow involved and has dirt on Assange. And so the charges seem really weak, but nonetheless, the U.S. is putting forward a lot of claims, including just inserting in there without really charging for it that Julian Assange is also guilty of helping Edward Snowden get out of Hong Kong. And so, all this is just kind of mounting and everything. But so, they tried to get, I believe, the new indictment thrown out. And the judge says, well, if you need more time to prepare for it, then that's what you need to do. And so the defense did something that they weren't necessarily, I think, hoping or expecting to do, but that was asking to adjourn the case until January. The reason they didn't want to do this, of course, is because Julian Assange's time in the Belmarsh maximum security prison in the UK has been absolutely miserable. The latest we know from people like Chris Murphy, Kevin Gunstola, and a few others who are attending the trial is that he doesn't look to be in good health. He has looked to lost more weight and isn't getting the medical care that he needs in Belmarsh. And so the hope is that Julian Assange gets to walk out of this trial a free man and then could go get all the different health care that he needs and take care of himself in a way that he's able to not only regain his physical but mental health in the years to come. And so getting him out of prison is essential to that. But at the same time, you had to be able to mount an effective defense. And so the defense team actually asked to extend the trial until January. And then the judge, her name is Vanessa Bannister, actually rejected this. And her point is that you already had an opportunity to ask for the delay in the trial, and they declined to do so. The defense team explained that, hey, like when we first got the superseding indictment, we didn't realize how much there was to it, and how that would change the U.S.'s case. But we now need that time to prepare. And you just said that the reason we're not throwing out this superseding indictment is because if you need time to prepare for it, you can. And then she says, no, you can't have that extra time to prepare. And so I think Craig Murphy, excuse me, I keep calling him Chris. He's the former UK ambassador to Uzbekistan who blew the whistle on a torture program that was happening there. Went ahead and said that he felt like this was just an example of Assange being railroaded, and the hypocrisy of the judge was really on display. So, Will, I don't know, what did I miss? What do you have to add?
Man, I think you pretty much hit all the major details. I mean, like, the major takeaway, I think, from this is just the first day of the extradition hearing. And, Assange formally declined. They asked him, do you agree to be extradited? So that, that kicked this all off, where he formally declined to be sent to the U.S. And so that started the whole proceedings. But yeah, the main takeaway that I got from this, too, is that, that Assange's defense had asked for a delay in the case. And they refused it because they said that, hey, you already had a chance to do that. And they said, but we didn't realize that, we'd be dealing with all the stuff in the superseding indictment with this, like, claims of Assange dealing with hacker groups. I think he was alleged to have dealt with, like, Lulsec or something, one of these hacker outfits in the superseding indictment. And so, they were denied that, though, denied the delay. But yeah, I think you pretty much hit on the major details. The one other thing I'd seen is that, like, I think at least 100 demonstrators gathered outside the court. So he does have some actual support there in London, protesting in his favor, I guess.
Right. Yeah, I saw there's gatherings around the world, and some in New York and some in other places. I saw Joe Lauria, explaining that he would have gone to the UK, but COVID, is in place, and then there's only Craig Murray actually got into the courtroom, but said that while there's seats for 40, they only allowed 5 because of social distancing, but then allowed all 5 of those people to sit together. There were then auxiliary rooms where you could go and get, I guess, a live stream of what was happening in the courtroom and actually be in the courthouse at the same time. John Pillager was one of these people who did that, but Craig Murray says that he left early because the feed kept cutting out. Joe Lauria said that Consortium News had received some kind of key to, get into the feed and watch it, but was kicked out of the feed. While he wouldn't speculate as to why he was kicked out, It does seem clear from everybody who is not present in the courtroom that you're not getting a very good feed of what's happening in that courtroom. And so we're really dependent on like Kevin Gunstola and Craig Murray to let us know what's happening in that courtroom, because it doesn't seem like there's a very good way to report on it outside of that. Now, maybe there's U.S. mainstream media outlets that get like the premiere feed or something like that. You got Disney Plus now and Disney Premiere, and so CNN gets the Disney Premiere feed where it doesn't cut out and it stays good, and maybe you get better audio quality or something like that.
Right, so they can smear Assange properly. Get the right quote to smear him with.
Right, you need the good audio quality of the UK prosecutor there to push this whole thing along. So I see maybe some of that going on, but really,
one thing I will say.
Yeah, go ahead.
I will just say, in terms of who's covering this, I was surprised, but the Daily Mail actually had like an extremely long, detailed write-up on this, which is kind of odd. It's like conservative British tabloid, but like I think they did have someone there, like in that feed room, because they had very detailed, way more than a lot of the American write-ups I saw. So
yeah, another outlet that seems to be very pro Assange right now is Al Jazeera for some reason. So go figure. You got good write-ups in the Daily Mail and Al Jazeera on Assange. But again, this is just the first day. Oh, and the last point I was going to make is that I think the important people to be able to, kind of access what's going on in that courtroom is, the members of the independent or alternative media who really do value Julian Assange and understand the importance of his work and, what it would mean to us as a group of people and as, a field of people to basically not be able to publish information without worrying that the U.S. government is going to arrest you for it. That's very concerning and a real problem. I think the last point I just had to make was that the first witness did testify, although in the write-ups I read, even from the likes of Kevin Gunstola or Craig Murphy, is that the testimony mattered less because of the superseding indictment, that this testimony by Mark Feldman was really going to be about what the role of a journalist is, what a journalist is supposed to do, and then why what Julian Assange is doing is journalism, and so therefore don't extradite him. But if they're now tacking on all these other charges, alleging all kinds of other conspiracies, that becomes a whole lot less important. But this is going to go on, I'm guessing, for a few weeks, Will, at the very least. And maybe there'll be an extension to this trial or something like that. But for now, it seems like Judge Bannister is trying to push it forward as fast as possible. Anything else on Assange?
No, I think we'll be updating his hearing as it goes on. But yeah, I think that's it for the first day.
So the last story I had here, what I think adds a little bit to something we had talked about in the end of yesterday's podcast as well, and that is just like police officers interacting with young kids. We have this study now from Florida, which is study finds more school arrests in Florida after state doubled the number of police in schools. And so in 2018, so after the Parkland shooting, Florida put as many cops in schools as they could, double the number. And what they found was that it increased the number of behavioral incidents in the schools. So not only did it increase the number of arrests, but it also create the number of like actual incidents where you would, have to have any kind of interaction between administration and student. And then they actually had to do more physical restraints as well. And so, this was striking, especially because there was a video that came out, I think from 2019, but it came out in the past couple of weeks, and it's, I believe, an 8-year-old boy in a Florida school. It's a young white child that a police attempts to handcuff him, but his wrists are literally too small for the handcuffs. They don't go that small. And so why you would ever need to handcuff an 8-year-old is completely unbelievable, or why the police would ever be involved. I guess unless this kid like exposed himself or something, like, even then, I don't see why you would need the police involved. But maybe there's some crazy thing where you would need to like call the police for some, file a report or something. But they actually had the police like walk this kid out of the school. It has to be a particularly traumatizing event. But you can't have police officers in schools because, police officers treat everybody like they're the most thuggish adult. And further proof of this is we now know that a Utah police officer recently shot a 13-year-old boy with autism. I guess his mom was attempting to go to work for the first time in a year. This is a situation that I like have some professional experience with, where there are parents who have children with such high anxiety and autism and other mental health issues that they almost have to stay home. But then once they try to go back to work, that's a really anxiety provoking thing for the kid. So this mom was supposed to go to work for the first time in a year. Kid ends up having what is described in the article as a mental breakdown. I don't exactly know what that means. That's not really a term that's used professionally anymore, having a mental breakdown. I would assume, he's acting very irrationally. He's like probably throwing stuff around. I'm not sure how verbal the kid is. Some, kids with autism tend not to talk. Others, will use some pretty nasty language. But anyways, so the mom calls 911 to call what they call the CIT, or the Crisis Intervention Team. And this is, if you're a parent who has a child with severe mental health, you'll be aware of these people. And they're essentially a team of mental health professionals who would come out and assess if a child, or I guess even an adult, needed to go to like a psychiatric hospital to get care. They need to be brought to the hospital to stabilize their meds and all that and get back on the right track. Well, for whatever reason, the cops came. And now I do know in some states the CIT is like the EMTs, where like if they show, the cops show. So it may have been one of those situations. I've also been involved in situations where the CIT team shows up, and they'll like spend quite a bit of time, and they are mental health professionals, and they will try to get the person that they need to bring to the hospital to go to get up and go with them. But if they don't, they will eventually bring the cops in, and then they'll be like, hey, if you don't get up and go, the cops are going to force you. I've fortunately have never witnessed anything where the cops were then forced to like move the child. Every time the child's been like, well, I really deal with anybody but the cops, and so they get up and go. But that's not what happened in this case. And then the mother reports hearing multiple gunshots, but all we know is that somehow the cop shot this 13-year-old child, again, with autism. Which, look, I've been, I worked at a therapy school for a few years. I have seen, I've never like been involved in a restraint, but the people who worked in the elementary school portion, they did restraints on elementary school kids. I watched, I'm not even joking, for an hour, a guy restrain a kid. It was like about a 13-year-old who was, flailing his body around. It's a lot of work to like restrain a kid whose body is flailing around, stuff like that. The kid's swearing at the whole time. One of my coworkers is a black guy. The kid's calling him the N-word and stuff like that. Not a single time do any of my coworkers ever, push harder against the kid because of something he says or because he hit him or bit him. They never call him any names. They, just stay calm. They say, we need you to calm down so we could let you go. They just keep repeating what they need to repeat and do it at most professionally. And then the next day, when not maybe the next day all the time, but whenever the kid comes back to school, nobody's ever, extra rude to the kid or anything like that. Like, that's the level of professionalism that like mental health care professionals bring, and cops show up and just start shooting people. That's why you can't have cops in schools, for just, one reason. So, Will, I know I just dropped a lot there, but is there anything else that you have to add on that?
No, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's a situation where like every problem is a nail, and they got a hammer. They are a hammer. And, I think that's a good metaphor, too, for what a hammer does to a person, smashing them. And that's what the police are, apparently doing in Florida, where, like you're saying, there's all this huge surge in like behavioral incidents And, it's not just a matter of the police are there to enforce it. So there's more like it seems to be actually provoking more incidents. Like there was actually another study in the Journal of Criminology and Public Policy, another study that found the same thing as this Florida University study that found that like the police presence in the schools does not make things safer, and that it really just leads to more like behavioral incidents and more disciplinary and harsher disciplinary action for these children. And so, that's unfortunate that, that's the trend.
Right. Well, there's this thing, and it's kind of a liberal buzzword, and a lot of times the people who talk about it don't actually intend to do anything about it. But this school to prison pipeline, which, does really exist,
Right.
where kids who have run in with the, their SEO officers in the school end up, eventually being arrested by that officer. And one of the things that I read particularly is that when you have more officers in schools, there's more arrests on drug issues. And so, all my years of, being in a school, the cops were never involved for like a drug issue. Like, kid has weed, kid has vape, whatever. We take it, we get rid of it. Kid, if they're high, they get sent home. You can't have a high kid at school. If they
You're saying the school you worked at, right?
Yeah. Right. And
not the one you went to.
Oh no, the high school I went to definitely arrested people, and we actually had
mine
drug
too.
dogs come in like at least once a month. They would have dogs come in and walk up and down the halls, and
leave your bag in the hallway.
Mm-hmm. And it sucked like if you had like a doctor's appointment that day, because then people would assume that you got popped for having some pot or something, because suddenly you're out of class.
Right.
You know what I mean? When the dogs come, everybody knows that whoever gets pulled out of class, and that's, well, they found whatever. And they actually, by my senior year, were like walking the dogs around the parking lot too, because we had, it was like a suburban school. So most of us drove by our definitely our senior year. I would say most of the class drove. And so they would walk the dogs around the parking lot too. And that's great. But yeah, like in part of it is that, like, if a 17-18-year-old smoking pot, like, it's not the biggest deal in the world. But if it is a serious, like, if you have a 17-18-year-old that's like engaging in some heroin use, that is concerning. That's a mental health issue and not a cop issue at all. And so people at the school sitting down, like, talking, giving the support the kid needs is what needs to be done, rather than just arresting them in front of everybody, which I'm sure just goes to reinforce this whole, idea for the kid that they're a bad kid, that they're, a loser or burnout or whatever, that, they internalize from these experiences, and, that this is kind of what their life is going to be, and what, what it should be like is basically drug use and run in with cops. That's this position a lot of people end up in, unfortunately, and it starts, right in school.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, well, that's all I have for the show today. You got anything else?
No. If people want to read what I write, best way to do that is to go to my Twitter handle @TheWillPorter. And if you're watching the video, you can see all the credentials and stuff of the conflict of interest pages. But we also have a Twitter page @con_interest. We're on Facebook, conflicts of interest, as well as YouTube. What do you got?
Yeah, the last thing I want to mention is that people are looking. We do have a Patreon page, and we are, I guess, we need to shop some ideas of, what people would like us to do in order to give us money. So if you have ideas, check out the old foreign policy focused Facebook group, and you could let us know in there. I guess we'll probably set up like a private group for donors somewhere. Most of the typical stuff like early released episodes or something like that. But there's, a particular thing that, people think that would, you benefit a certain kind of content that me and Will could put out. Let us know, and, whatever to get some money, we will do that. And make sure you subscribe to all the podcast feeds wherever you want to listen, and switch over from the foreign policy focused ones if you're still listening on that. Ratings and reviews, especially subscribing on YouTube, would be helpful at this point. And thanks, Will.
Thanks, Cal. Peace, man.